What if I told you that every Formula One driver from the 2010 seconds could be placed into exactly 7 distinct levels of skill and achievement? And what if some of your favorite drivers ended up in completely different categories than you'd expect? Over the past decade, we witnessed some of the most incredible racing talent in F1 history. But when you really break down their performances, statistics, and impact on the sport, a clear hierarchy emerges that might shock you. Today we're going through every single significant F1 driver from 2010 to 2019 and placing them into 7 precise levels based on their raw speed, racecraft, championship success, and overall legacy. Some legendary names are going to end up lower than you think, while others might surprise you by climbing higher than their reputation suggests. By the end of this video, you'll have a completely new perspective on how the grid actually stacked up during one of the most competitive decades in Formula One history. But before we dive into these controversial rankings, let me set the ground rules. We're looking at drivers who competed significantly during the 2010 seconds decade, not just a handful of races. We're weighing multiple factors, including one-lap pace, race pace, wheel-to-wheel combat, adaptability to different regulations, championship success, and their ability to extract maximum performance from their machinery. This isn't just about who won the most races or championships, because as we'll see, some drivers achieved incredible things with inferior equipment, while others had every advantage but failed to capitalize. Let's start at the bottom and work our way up to the absolute pinnacle of 2010 seconds F1 talent. Level 7 represents the drivers who showed flashes of potential but ultimately struggled to establish themselves as consistent performers at the highest level. These aren't necessarily bad drivers, but they failed to make a lasting impact during their time in Formula One throughout the 2010 seconds. Pastor Maldonado sits firmly in this category. Despite winning that incredible race in Spain 2012 for Williams, his career was defined more by inconsistency and accidents than genuine pace. He had raw speed, no doubt about it, but his decision-making and racecraft let him down repeatedly. In an era where even lower-tier teams could occasionally fight for points, Maldonado's trophy cabinet remained largely empty beyond that single victory. Jean-Éric Vergne also finds himself here, though this might be controversial. Yes, he went on to become a Formula E champion, but during his F1 stint with Toro Rosso, he never quite delivered on his junior category promise. He was regularly matched or beaten by teammates and failed to secure that crucial promotion to Red Bull. His pace was respectable, but in the cutthroat world of Formula One, respectable isn't enough. Marcus Ericsson rounds out this level, a solid driver who rarely made mistakes, but also rarely showed the kind of pace that marks out future champions. His Sauber years were characterized by consistent mediocrity rather than standout performances. He's since found success in IndyCar, proving he has talent, but his F1 chapter was forgettable. Moving up to level 6, we find drivers who establish themselves as capable Formula One competitors, but lack that extra gear needed to challenge for victories or championships consistently. Romain Grosjean epitomizes this level, incredibly fast on his day, as evidenced by his pole positions and podium finishes, but plagued by inconsistency and poor decision-making in crucial moments. His 2012 season was particularly frustrating, where he showed genuine pace, but threw away points with avoidable mistakes. The Bahrain incident that year perfectly encapsulated his career, tremendous speed overshadowed by questionable judgment. Esteban Gutierrez spent several seasons with Sauber, showing decent pace, but never quite breaking through to that next level. He had the speed to compete in the midfield, but lacked the killer instinct needed to maximize opportunities when they arose. His comeback attempt with Haas showed he still had the pace, but consistency remained elusive. Kamui Kobayashi was genuinely exciting to watch, particularly in his Sauber days where he pulled off some stunning overtakes and showed real racecraft. However, he never quite developed the consistency needed for championship contention. His aggressive style was entertaining but sometimes counterproductive in terms of point scoring. Level 5 brings us to drivers who were genuinely quick and capable of excellent performances but fell short of the very top tier due to various limitations. Sergio Perez deserves recognition here for his incredible ability to make tires last and his wet weather prowess. His victories for Racing Point and later Red Bull proved he had genuine pace, but his qualifying performances often let him down. Throughout the 2010 seconds, he was the master of damage limitation and strategic racing, turning poor grid positions into solid points finishes. His podium drought between 2012 and 2020 wasn't entirely due to machinery limitations. Felipe Massa experienced a renaissance of sorts during the 2010 seconds after his 2009 accident. While never quite reaching his pre-accident heights, he remained a formidable competitor, particularly at Williams, where he dragged impressive performances from an improving but still limited car. His wheel-to-wheel racing remained excellent, and he showed he could still deliver when the pressure was on. Nico Hülkenberg might be the most talented driver never to score a podium, which perfectly encapsulates his Level 5 status. His qualifying pace was exceptional throughout the decade, regularly putting midfield cars where they had no business being. His racecraft was solid, his tire management excellent, and his consistency remarkable. However, he never quite had that extra spark needed to grab unlikely victories when opportunities arose. Paul di Resta and Adrian Sutil both showed flashes of genuine pace during their Force India stints. Di Resta in particular looked like a future race winner during his early seasons, regularly outperforming the car's expected position. However, neither quite developed into the consistent point scorers their pace suggested they could become. Level 4 represents drivers who achieved notable success and showed championship-caliber speed in certain areas, but had clear weaknesses that prevented them from reaching the very top. Jenson Button's 2010 seconds were defined by his incredible wet weather ability and tire management skills. While his McLaren years were frustrating due to reliability issues, he consistently extracted maximum performance from difficult cars. His Hungary 2011 drive remains one of the great comeback victories, showcasing his ability to read changing conditions better than almost anyone. However, his qualifying pace was often lacking, and he sometimes struggled to find speed in stable conditions. Felipe Nasr showed tremendous promise during his Sauber years, particularly in 2015 when he regularly outpaced more experienced teammates. His racecraft was excellent, and he had genuine one-lap pace. Unfortunately, his career was cut short just as he was hitting his stride, but the speed he showed suggested he could have developed into something special. Kimi Raikkonen's second Ferrari stint and subsequent Alfa Romeo years put him firmly in this level. While his pace remained impressive well into his 40s, he was no longer the dominant force he'd been in his prime. His 2018 season showed he could still win races when everything aligned, but consistency over a full season became increasingly difficult. His natural speed never diminished, but his motivation and adaptability to new regulations sometimes wavered. Pastor Maldonado could have been here instead of Level 7 based purely on pace, but his lack of consistency and poor decision-making ultimately held him back. When he was on form, particularly in qualifying trim, he was genuinely quick enough to challenge for poles and victories. Level 3 brings us to drivers who were legitimate championship contenders and showed all the skills necessary to win at the highest level, but ultimately fell short due to circumstances, timing, or small margins. Valtteri Bottas achieved multiple race victories and regularly challenged for championships during his Mercedes years. His one-lap pace was exceptional, often matching or beating Lewis Hamilton in qualifying. However, his race starts and wheel-to-wheel combat were sometimes lacking, and he struggled to maintain consistency under championship pressure. On pure pace, he deserved his place at Mercedes, but he lacked the killer instinct needed to capitalize on his opportunities. Daniel Ricciardo burst onto the scene with Red Bull and immediately established himself as a future championship contender. His overtaking ability was phenomenal, his racecraft exemplary, and his speed undeniable. Those 3 victories in 2014 weren't flukes. He genuinely had the pace to challenge Sebastian Vettel. However, his move to Renault and subsequent struggles at McLaren showed he wasn't quite adaptable enough to excel in every circumstance. Fernando Alonso's 2010 seconds Ferrari years were simultaneously brilliant and heartbreaking. His 2012 championship challenge remains one of the great what-ifs in Formula One history. His ability to overdrive inferior machinery was unmatched, regularly putting the Ferrari in positions it had no business occupying. However, his political maneuvering and team relationships sometimes created unnecessary friction that may have cost him championships. Charles Leclerc's emergence at the end of the decade immediately marked him as championship material. His raw speed was evident from his first season, and his ability to adapt to different cars and conditions was impressive. However, his decision-making in crucial moments still needed refinement, as evidenced by several costly errors during his Ferrari breakthrough season. Nico Rosberg deserves massive credit for his 2016 championship victory, proving he had the mental strength and consistency needed to beat one of the greatest drivers in history over a full season. His adaptability to the hybrid era was excellent, and his political acumen within Mercedes was underestimated. However, his immediate retirement suggests even he recognized that sustaining that level against Hamilton would be nearly impossible. Level 2 represents drivers who dominated significant portions of the decade and showed championship-winning ability repeatedly. Sebastian Vettel's early 2010 seconds dominance with Red Bull was absolute. 4 consecutive championships don't happen by accident, and his ability to control races from the front was masterful. His 2013 season in particular showed a driver at the absolute peak of his powers. However, his struggles with the hybrid-era cars and his tendency to crack under ultimate pressure when fighting from behind showed he wasn't quite perfect. Max Verstappen's emergence during the latter half of the decade immediately established him as a future multiple champion. His racecraft was otherworldly, his adaptability to different cars impressive, and his speed undeniable. Those early victories with Red Bull showcased a driver who could maximize every opportunity. However, his hot-headedness in certain situations and occasional strategic errors kept him from perfect status during this decade. Level 1 represents the absolute pinnacle of 2010 seconds. Formula One talent, drivers who showed sustained excellence across multiple seasons and proved they could win under any circumstances. Lewis Hamilton stands alone at the top of this hierarchy. His 6 championships during the decade, combined with his ability to perform under pressure, his wet weather mastery, and his consistency across different regulations, mark him as the driver of the decade. His 2018 championship fight against Vettel showcased his ability to win when the pressure was highest, while his 2020 season demonstrated sustained excellence even when lacking motivation. What makes Hamilton special isn't just his natural speed, though that's undeniable. It's his ability to find extra performance when it matters most, his racecraft in wheel-to-wheel combat, and his consistency across different eras of Formula One. He adapted seamlessly from the V8 era to the hybrid era, maintained his speed well into his 30s, and showed time and again that he could deliver when championships were on the line. Some might argue that Sebastian Vettel deserves equal billing based on his 4 championships, but Hamilton's sustained success across a longer period, his superior wet weather ability, and his head-to-head record in equal machinery give him the edge. The fascinating thing about these levels is how much external factors influenced where drivers ended up. Alonso probably had the pure speed to compete with Hamilton, but Ferrari's strategic mistakes and car development issues limited his championship opportunities. Ricciardo showed championship-caliber pace, but never had championship-caliber machinery at the right time. Verstappen emerged too late in the decade to accumulate the statistics needed for Level 1 status, though his subsequent success proves his talent. What's most interesting is how these rankings might shift if we extended the analysis into the 2020 seconds. Several drivers have moved significantly up or down based on their recent performances. Verstappen has clearly established himself as a Level 1 driver. Leclerc has continued his development and proven his 2019 performances weren't flukes. Meanwhile, drivers like Vettel and Alonso have shown that age and motivation can affect even the most talented competitors. The 2010 seconds decade gave us some of the most competitive Formula One seasons in history, with multiple drivers capable of winning championships given the right circumstances. The technical regulations created opportunities for different driving styles to succeed. From Hamilton's adaptability to Vettel's precision, to Ricciardo's racecraft, to Alonso's ability to overdrive inferior machinery. These 7 levels represent not just speed or success, but the complete package of what makes a Formula One driver great. Raw pace gets you noticed, but consistency, racecraft, adaptability, and mental strength separate the good from the great. The drivers in Level 1 didn't just have speed, they had the complete skill set needed to maximize every opportunity and deliver when it mattered most. Looking back at this incredible decade of racing, It's clear that we witnessed some of the greatest talents in Formula One history competing simultaneously. The depth of quality throughout these 7 levels shows just how competitive the sport became during this period. Even drivers in Level 7 had genuine pace and talent. They were simply competing against an exceptionally strong field, where small margins made huge differences in career trajectories and historical legacies. The 1,990 seconds were absolutely insane for Formula One. We're talking about an era where drivers could literally die on any given Sunday, where technology was exploding faster than anyone could regulate it, and where the skill gap between different tiers of drivers was so massive it was almost comical. Today, I'm breaking down the 7 distinct levels of F1 drivers that existed during this wild decade, and trust me, some of these categories will shock you. Before we dive in, let me set the stage. The 1,990 seconds in Formula One were like the Wild West of motorsport. Teams were spending ungodly amounts of money, cars were becoming rocket ships, and the driver market was more cutthroat than a Game of Thrones episode. We had legends cementing their status, rookies burning out faster than their tire compounds, and everything in between. Level 7 represents the bottom tier, what I call the see-it-warmers. These were drivers who somehow found their way into F1 cars, but honestly had no business being there. We're talking about guys who were either there because of massive sponsorship deals, political connections, or simply because teams needed bodies in cars and couldn't find anyone better. Take someone like Jean-Denis Delatraz. This guy managed to get drives with multiple teams throughout the decade, but his results were consistently underwhelming. He'd qualify dead last, finish multiple laps down if he finished at all, and provided entertainment value mainly through his ability to find creative ways to crash or break down. These drivers were essentially moving chicanes, obstacles for the real racers to navigate around. The cruel reality for Level 7 drivers was that they were often painfully aware of their limitations, but trapped by the economics of the sport. Many brought significant funding to cash-strapped teams, making them valuable despite their lack of speed. They'd show flashes of competence in testing or practice, just enough to keep their seats warm, but race day would inevitably expose their shortcomings. Level 6 drivers were what I call the journeymen. These guys had genuine speed and belonged in Formula One, but they lacked that extra something needed to compete at the highest level. They could qualify respectably, occasionally score points, and wouldn't embarrass themselves, but they were never going to challenge for victories. Drivers like Pierluigi Martini perfectly embodied this category. Martini had legitimate talent and could extract performance from mediocre machinery, but he spent most of his career with backmarker teams. He'd occasionally surprise everyone with a points finish, maybe even a podium if the stars aligned perfectly, but consistency at the highest level eluded him. The journeymen were often beloved by fans because they represented pure racing spirit. They weren't there for politics or money. They genuinely loved racing and squeezed every tenth of a second from whatever car they were given. They understood racecraft, could battle wheel to wheel, and served as excellent benchmarks for measuring upcoming talent. Level 5 brings us to the solid professionals. These drivers formed the backbone of Formula One's middle tier. They were genuinely quick, could handle pressure, and teams knew exactly what they'd get from them every weekend. No surprises, no drama, just consistent, professional performance. Think about someone like Martin Brundle. Here was a driver who could have easily been a race winner in the right machinery, but circumstances never quite aligned for him. Brundle was incredibly intelligent about racecraft, understood car setup intuitively, and could adapt to any situation thrown at him. He became the definition of a safe pair of hands. The solid professionals were crucial for teams because they provided stability. While they might not deliver miraculous victories, they wouldn't throw away points through silly mistakes either. They understood the long game of championship battles and could play supporting roles perfectly when needed. These guys often transitioned seamlessly into television commentary or team management after their driving careers ended. Level 4 represents the race winners. This is where we start separating the wheat from the chaff in terms of raw talent and opportunity convergence. These drivers had the speed and racecraft to win Grands Prix, but either lacked consistent top-tier machinery or had some other limiting factor preventing championship contention. Drivers like Gene Alesi epitomized this level. Alesi was blindingly fast and could produce moments of absolute brilliance, but his career was marked by poor timing and questionable team choices. He finally won his only Grand Prix in 1995 with Ferrari, a victory that was both triumphant and heartbreaking, because it highlighted what might have been if circumstances had been different. The race winners category was perhaps the most frustrating for fans and drivers alike. These guys clearly had championship-caliber talent, but were held back by factors often beyond their control. They dominate an inferior machinery, showing flashes of genius that made everyone wonder what they could accomplish in a truly competitive car. Level 3 takes us to the championship contenders. These were drivers who regularly fought for titles, consistently performed at the highest level, and were considered among the elite of their era. They had the complete package of speed, intelligence, consistency, and mental strength needed for sustained excellence. David Coulthard represents this tier perfectly. Throughout the late 90s, Coulthard was always in the mix for championships, regularly winning races and mounting serious title challenges. He had the speed to match anyone on his day, the intelligence to manage races strategically, and the consistency to accumulate points throughout entire seasons. Championship contenders were the drivers everyone watched most closely during title fights. They elevated the level of competition simply by their presence and forced everyone else to raise their game. These guys understood the psychological aspects of championship battles and could perform under the most intense pressure imaginable. Level 2 brings us to the dominant forces. These were drivers who didn't just compete for championships, they dominated entire eras of Formula One. We're talking about guys who could take control of races from the opening lap and dictate terms to everyone else on track. Nigel Mansell in the early 90s perfectly embodied this level. When Mansell was on form, he was virtually unbeatable. His 1,992 season was one of the most dominant in Formula One history, winning 9 of the first 10 races and clinching the championship with 5 races remaining. Mansell had this incredible ability to extract performance from cars that seemed impossible, pushing machinery beyond its theoretical limits through pure willpower and skill. Dominant forces changed the entire dynamic of Formula One during their peak periods. Other drivers and teams had to completely restructure their approaches just to compete with them. They set new standards for what was possible in terms of both speed and racecraft. Finally, Level 1 represents the legends, drivers who transcended Formula One and became global icons. These weren't just the fastest drivers of their era, they were complete phenomena who elevated the entire sport through their presence. The obvious choice here is Ayrton Senna. Senna wasn't just fast, he was otherworldly. His ability to find speed in wet conditions bordered on supernatural, and his qualifying performances redefined what people thought was possible in a Formula One car. But beyond pure speed, Senna had this incredible presence that affected everyone around him. Watching Senna drive was like witnessing poetry in motion. He could make cars dance through corners that other drivers could barely navigate, and his racecraft, under pressure, was absolutely phenomenal. The man could conjure lap times from thin air when it mattered most, pulling pole positions out of seemingly impossible situations. What separated the legends from even the dominant forces was their ability to inspire and intimidate simultaneously. Other drivers raised their game just trying to match them, but also knew they were competing against something beyond normal human capability. The fascinating thing about these 7 levels is how fluid they could be. Drivers would move between categories throughout their careers based on machinery, form, and circumstances. A solid professional might suddenly become a race winner with the right car change, or a championship contender might slip back to journeyman status if their team lost competitiveness. The economic realities of Formula One in the 90s also meant that talent didn't always correlate with opportunity. Some of the fastest drivers spent years in uncompetitive machinery, while less talented but better funded drivers occupied seats with top teams. This created incredible frustration, but also some of the most compelling storylines in motorsport history. Technology played a huge role in determining which level drivers could operate at. The introduction of sophisticated electronics, traction control systems, and advanced aerodynamics meant that some drivers who had thrived in the simpler cars of previous eras suddenly found themselves struggling to adapt. Meanwhile, younger drivers who grew up with video games and computer technology seemed naturally suited to these more complex machines. The physical demands of Formula One in the 90s were also brutal. Cars were faster and more demanding than ever before. but safety equipment was still relatively primitive compared to modern standards. This meant that only drivers with exceptional physical and mental resilience could consistently perform at the highest levels. What made this era particularly special was the incredible depth of talent across all 7 levels. Even the seat warmers were typically accomplished drivers in other categories who just couldn't quite make the step up to Formula One. The competition was so intense that careers could be made or destroyed by a single season, sometimes by a single race. The media coverage of Formula One in the 90s also amplified these distinctions between driver levels. Television technology was improving rapidly, allowing fans to see subtle differences in driving techniques that had previously been invisible. This created more informed audiences who could appreciate the nuances that separated a solid professional from a championship contender. Looking back at this incredible decade, it's clear that the 7 levels of Formula One drivers created one of the most competitive and entertaining eras in motorsport history. Each level contributed something essential to the overall spectacle, from the legends who provided moments of pure magic to the seat warmers who reminded everyone just how difficult Formula One really was. The legacy of 90s Formula One continues to influence the sport today. Many current team principals, commentators, and technical directors came from this era, bringing lessons learned during these incredibly competitive times. The driver development programs that exist today were largely inspired by the need to systematically identify and nurture talent across all these different levels. Understanding these 7 levels helps explain why Formula One in the 90s remained so beloved by fans. It wasn't just about the fastest driver winning. It was about watching human drama play out at incredible speeds, with drivers constantly fighting to move up levels while others struggled to maintain their positions. That's what made every single race, appointment, television, and why we still talk about this era as the golden age of Formula One. Picture this. You're sitting behind the wheel of a machine that's basically a rocket with wheels. No safety harness, no helmet laws, and if you crash, well, let's just say there's no medical helicopter coming to save you. Welcome to Formula One in the 1,950 seconds, where drivers weren't just racing against each other, they were racing against death itself. Today, we're diving deep into the 7 distinct levels of drivers that dominated this golden yet terrifying era of motorsport. And trust me, the stories you're about to hear will blow your mind. The 1,950 seconds marked the birth of the modern Formula One World Championship. But these weren't your typical athletes. These men were gladiators in leather helmets, pioneers who wrote the rule book with their blood, sweat, and, unfortunately, sometimes their lives. From weekend warriors who showed up with borrowed cars, to absolute legends whose names still echo through racing history, each level tells a story of courage, skill, and the relentless pursuit of speed. But here's what most people don't realize about 1,950 seconds Formula One. It wasn't just about who was fastest. It was about who could survive long enough to cross the finish line, who had the connections to get a decent car, and who possessed that special combination of talent and madness that separated the wheat from the chaff. So buckle up, because we're about to take you on a journey through 7 levels that defined an entire generation of racing. Level 7 represents the bottom tier, the gentlemen privateers. These were wealthy enthusiasts who basically bought their way into Formula One, and I'm not talking about modern pay drivers with years of training. These guys would literally show up at Monaco with a car they'd purchased, maybe practiced a few laps, and then line up on the starting grid next to world champions. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that was just Tuesday. In 1,950 seconds F1, take someone like Prince Bira of Thailand, who raced under the colorful name B. Bira. This guy was royalty who decided racing looked fun, bought himself some competitive machinery, and actually wasn't terrible at it. But the majority of Level 7 drivers were there for the thrill, rather than genuine championship aspirations. They'd often qualify last, finish last if they finished at all, and their main contribution was providing entertainment value and helping fill out the grid. What made these gentlemen privateers fascinating wasn't their lap times, it was their sheer audacity. In an era where a mechanical failure could easily result in death, these wealthy adventurers were essentially playing the world's most expensive and dangerous game of roulette. Some lasted a season, others lasted a race, but they all shared one thing: more money than sense, and a death wish that would make modern safety officials faint. The financial barrier to entry was actually lower than you might expect, but the skill barrier was essentially non-existent. If you could afford a car and entry fees, you were in. This created some truly bizarre situations, where you'd have a titled nobleman starting dead last, 20 seconds off the pace, sharing the same track with future legends. It was motorsport's version of open mic night, except with 200 horsepower death traps. Level 6 brings us to the weekend warriors. Drivers who had some genuine talent but treated Formula One more like an expensive hobby than a career. These weren't quite as wealthy as the gentlemen privateers, but they had enough resources to compete occasionally and enough skill to not embarrass themselves completely. Think of them as the enthusiastic amateurs who could actually drive. These drivers typically had day jobs. They might be successful businessmen, doctors, or engineers who happened to be handy behind the wheel. They'd show up to selected races throughout the season, usually the prestigious ones like Monaco or their home Grand Prix, and put in respectable if not spectacular performances. Unlike Level 7, these guys could actually qualify in the middle of the pack and sometimes even score points. The weekend warriors represented something beautiful about 1,950 seconds Formula One. The idea that if you had talent and determination, you could rub shoulders with the sport's elite, even if just for a weekend. Many of these drivers had legitimate racing backgrounds from other series, but Formula One was their chance to test themselves against the absolute best in the world. What's remarkable is how some weekend warriors would occasionally surprise everyone. They'd show up to a race, maybe benefit from some mechanical failures ahead of them, and suddenly find themselves on the podium next to guys who raced full-time. It was the kind of underdog story that modern Formula One, with its strict licensing and massive budgets, has largely eliminated. The beauty of Level 6 was its unpredictability. You never knew when a weekend warrior might have the race of his life, or when the pressure of competing against full-time professionals might expose their limitations. They were the wild cards that made every race grid an interesting mix of proven professionals and talented wild cards. Level 5 introduces us to the full-time hopefuls, drivers who had committed their lives to Formula One but were struggling to find consistent competitive machinery. These weren't wealthy dilettantes. These were serious racers who'd made the sport their profession, but found themselves stuck in the middle tier of equipment and opportunities. Full-time hopefuls were often incredibly talented drivers trapped in inferior cars. They'd spend the season bouncing between different teams, taking whatever drives they could find, always hoping that their next opportunity would be the one that launched them into the upper echelons of the sport. Many had proven themselves in other racing categories but couldn't secure rides with the top Formula One teams. What made Level 5 tragic and inspiring in equal measure was witnessing genuinely gifted drivers waste their prime years in uncompetitive machinery. They'd occasionally show flashes of brilliance, maybe qualifying surprisingly well in the rain or putting in a stunning drive to score points from nowhere. But consistency eluded them because they rarely had consistent equipment. These drivers lived season to season, sometimes race to race, never knowing if their current ride would be their last. The financial pressures were enormous because, unlike the gentlemen privateers, they didn't have family wealth to fall back on. Racing was their livelihood, but it was a precarious one that could disappear with a single poor performance or a team's financial problems. The full-time hopefuls represented the professional racing class that modern Formula One eventually evolved into, but in the 1,950 seconds, they existed in a strange limbo between the amateur enthusiasts and the established stars. They had all the dedication and most of the talent needed to succeed, but lacked the crucial element of opportunity that separates good drivers from great careers. Level 4 brings us to the solid professionals, drivers who had established themselves as reliable, consistent performers, capable of regularly scoring points and occasionally challenging for victories. These weren't necessarily household names, but they were the backbone of Formula One grids throughout the decade. Solid professionals had typically proven themselves through years of consistent performance. They weren't the fastest drivers on the grid, but they were smart, experienced, and knew how to maximize their equipment's potential. In an era where mechanical reliability was questionable and driver error could be fatal, these qualities were incredibly valuable. What distinguished Level 4 from lower tiers was their ability to deliver results consistently. While weekend warriors might have one great race per season, solid professionals were scoring points regularly, finishing races reliably, and occasionally capitalizing on opportunities when faster drivers encountered problems. They were the drivers team managers knew they could count on. Many solid professionals had long careers precisely because they were so dependable. They might not have been championship material, but they were valuable commodities in a sport where so many variables could go wrong. Teams knew that hiring a Level 4 driver meant getting someone who would bring the car home, score points, and help with car development. The interesting thing about solid professionals was how some of them evolved during their careers. A few managed to step up their game and move into higher levels, while others found their niche and became specialists at certain types of races or conditions. They represented the professional standard that the sport was gradually developing. Level 3 takes us to the race winners, drivers who had proven they could win Formula One races but hadn't quite achieved championship-level consistency. These were genuinely elite talents who could beat anyone on their day, but lacked either the equipment or the consistency to mount serious title challenges. Race winners were the drivers who provided much of the season's excitement beyond the championship battle. They were fast enough to win races when everything went right, which meant they were always potential spoilers for the championship contenders. This created fascinating strategic dynamics and unpredictable race outcomes. What made Level 3 drivers special was their ability to rise to occasions. They might struggle for points in some races, but when the conditions were right, whether it was their home Grand Prix, a favorite circuit, or just one of those magical days when everything clicked, they could beat anyone. These breakthrough victories often became defining moments of their careers. The tragic element of many race winners was that they often had all the talent needed to be champions, but were let down by unreliable equipment or bad timing. In a different era or with better opportunities, several Level 3 drivers could easily have been championship contenders. They represented the fine margins that separate good careers from great ones. Race winners also served as measuring sticks for the true elite. When a championship contender could consistently beat a Level 3 driver, it demonstrated their superiority. But when they lost to one, it revealed either their own weaknesses or the race winner's special capabilities on that particular day. Level 2 brings us to the championship contenders, drivers who regularly fought for world titles and represented the absolute elite of 1,950 seconds Formula One. These weren't just fast drivers, they were complete racers who combined speed, intelligence, consistency, and often a fair bit of luck to challenge for motorsport's ultimate prize. Championship contenders were the drivers who made the sport compelling for fans. They provided the season-long narratives that kept people engaged, the rivalries that created drama, and the performances that defined eras. In the 1,950 seconds, this level included some of the most respected names in racing history. What separated Level 2 from lower tiers was their ability to perform under championship pressure. It's one thing to win a race when nothing's at stake. It's entirely different to deliver results when a world title hangs in the balance. Championship contenders thrived in these high-pressure situations and often produced their best performances when it mattered most. The psychological demands on championship contenders were enormous. They had to balance aggression with intelligence, risk with reward, and maintain focus throughout seasons that could last many months. In an era where a single mistake could end not just a race but a career, this mental strength was crucial. Many championship contenders defined their legacies not just by titles won, but by how they competed for them. Some were known for their raw speed, others for their tactical brilliance, and still others for their ability to perform in adverse conditions. Each brought something unique to their championship challenges. Level 1 represents the absolute pinnacle, the legendary champions who not only won world titles, but transcended the sport itself. These were drivers who became cultural icons, whose names are still revered decades later, and who fundamentally shaped what Formula One became. The legendary champions of the 1,950 seconds weren't just great drivers, they were pioneers who established many of the standards and traditions that define Formula One to this day. They competed in the sport's most dangerous era, when survival was never guaranteed, yet managed to achieve sustained excellence that set them apart from everyone else. What made these drivers legendary wasn't just their statistics, though those were impressive enough. It was their impact on the sport's development, their influence on future generations of drivers, and their ability to capture public imagination in ways that transcended motorsport. They became the template for what a Formula One champion should be. The 1,950 seconds legendary champions had to overcome challenges that modern drivers can barely imagine. They raced on circuits with minimal safety barriers, in cars with virtually no crash protection, and often in weather conditions that would cancel races today. Their achievements were earned through a combination of skill, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. These champions also helped establish Formula One's global appeal. Their exploits were covered by international media. Their rivalries created storylines that captivated fans worldwide, and their personalities helped define the sport's character during its formative years. Juan Manuel Fangio stands as the ultimate example of a 1,950 seconds legendary champion. The Argentine master won 5 world championships during the decade, a record that stood for nearly 50 years. What made Fangio special wasn't just his speed, though he was undoubtedly fast, but his complete mastery of every aspect of racing. Fangio possessed an almost supernatural ability to extract maximum performance from any car he drove. He won championships with 4 different manufacturers, adapting his driving style to suit each car's characteristics while maintaining his competitive edge. This versatility was unprecedented and remains remarkable even by today's standards. The respect Fangio commanded from his peers was absolute. Other drivers, including fierce competitors, openly acknowledged his superiority. He had a calming presence that could settle nervous teammates and an analytical mind that made him invaluable for car development. Teams would restructure their entire operations around him. What truly set Fangio apart was his racecraft, his ability to manage races strategically while never losing his competitive fire. He could drive conservatively when necessary to preserve equipment, then unleash devastating speed when victory required it. This tactical intelligence separated him from purely fast drivers. Fangio's legacy extends far beyond his championship tally. He established the template for the complete racing driver: fast, intelligent, professional, and respected. Modern champions still measure themselves against standards he set over 70 years ago, which speaks to the timeless nature of his excellence. Alberto Ascari represents another level of 1,950 seconds greatness, winning back-to-back championships in 1952 and 1953. The Italian's achievements were remarkable not just for their success, but for the dominant manner in which he achieved them. During his championship years, Ascari was virtually unbeatable. Ascari's driving style was characterized by incredible precision and consistency. While others relied on raw speed or dramatic late-race charges, Ascari methodically dismantled his competition through perfect execution. He rarely made mistakes, almost never crashed, and seemed to have an innate understanding of exactly how hard to push. The technical knowledge Ascari brought to his teams was extraordinary. He could diagnose mechanical problems, suggest setup changes, and communicate effectively with engineers. This made him not just a driver, but a complete package that elevated any team he joined. His feedback was so valuable that teams would often develop cars specifically around his input. What made Ascari's dominance even more impressive was the strength of his competition. He wasn't winning easy championships. He was beating other genuinely elite drivers at their peak. His consecutive titles came against fields that included multiple future Hall of Fame talents, making his achievements even more meaningful. Ascari's tragic death in 1955, just days after his 36th birthday, robbed the sport of what could have been many more championship battles. He was still at his peak when he died, leading many to wonder how many more titles he might have won. His legacy remains that of a perfectionist who achieved greatness through precision rather than spectacular heroics. The 7 levels of 1,950 seconds Formula One drivers created a fascinating ecosystem that modern motorsport has largely lost. The diversity of backgrounds, motivations, and skill levels made every race unpredictable and every season a journey through different stories and personalities. What made this era special was how these different levels interacted on track. You might have a legendary champion starting next to a gentleman privateer, creating David versus Goliath scenarios that could produce unexpected results. The lack of modern safety regulations meant every driver, regardless of skill level, faced the same mortal risks. The 1,950 seconds also represented Formula One's last era of true accessibility. While it required significant resources, the barriers to entry were lower than they would ever be again. This created opportunities for talented drivers from diverse backgrounds to reach the sport's highest levels, though it also exposed less capable drivers to dangers they weren't equipped to handle. Looking back, these 7 levels tell the story of a sport in transition. Formula One was evolving from a wealthy gentleman's hobby into a professional sport, but it hadn't yet completed that transformation. The result was a fascinating mixture of old-world amateur spirit and cutting-edge professional competition. The legacy of 1,950 seconds, Formula One drivers extends far beyond their era. They established traditions, set standards, and created legends that still influence the sport today. Modern drivers still compete for trophies named after 1,950 seconds champions, race on updated versions of circuits these pioneers made famous, and chase records these drivers established. Understanding these 7 levels helps us appreciate how far Formula One has evolved while recognizing what we might have lost along the way. The 1,950 seconds were simultaneously the sport's most dangerous and most romantic period, when individual heroism mattered more than team resources and when every race weekend could produce genuine surprises. Today's Formula One is undoubtedly safer, more professional, and more technically advanced than its 1,950 seconds ancestor. But something was lost in that evolution. The unpredictability, the accessibility, and the sense that anyone with talent and courage might have a chance to become a legend. The 7 levels of 1,950 seconds drivers represent a unique chapter in motorsport history that can never be repeated, but will always be remembered. Did you know that in the 1,960 seconds, Formula One was so dangerous that drivers had a 1 in 3 chance of dying behind the wheel? Yet some racers were making less money than a factory worker, while others lived like kings? The decade that transformed motorsport forever had a brutal hierarchy that separated legends from footnotes in racing history. Today we're diving deep into the 7 distinct levels of Formula One drivers that existed during the most revolutionary decade in racing. From weekend warriors who showed up with borrowed helmets to immortal champions who redefined what it meant to be fast, this ranking system will shock you with how different the sport was just 60 years ago. But before we reveal which level produced the most world champions and which one had the highest fatality rate, let me paint you a picture of just how wild Formula One was in the 1,960 seconds. Imagine racing at 180 miles per hour with no safety barriers, wearing a cotton shirt and a leather helmet that offered about as much protection as a bicycle helmet today. The cars had no roll cages, no fire suppression systems, and fuel tanks that could explode on impact. Yet somehow, this decade produced some of the most legendary drivers in motorsport history. The hierarchy we're about to explore wasn't just about talent or speed. It was about survival, politics, money, and sometimes pure luck. Some drivers at the bottom levels had more natural ability than world champions, but circumstances, timing, or tragedy kept them from reaching the top. Others climbed from the very bottom to become household names through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to cheat death. Level 7 represents the dreamers and the desperate. These were the gentleman racers, the wealthy enthusiasts, and the occasional con artist who somehow talked their way into a Formula One cockpit. In an era when team budgets were tiny and grid spots were sometimes available to anyone with enough cash, Level 7, drivers filled out race entries across Europe. Picture this. A businessman from Milan decides he wants to try Formula One racing. He buys an outdated Cooper or Lotus, shows up to Monaco or Monza, and finds himself sharing the grid with future world champions. Some of these drivers had never raced anything faster than a sports car. Others were weekend warriors who treated Formula One like an expensive hobby. The most famous Level 7 driver was probably Prince Bira of Thailand. Though he raced mainly in the 1,950 seconds, his influence carried into the 1,960 seconds, as other wealthy amateurs followed his example. These drivers typically finished last when they finished at all, but they served a crucial purpose in an era when Formula One desperately needed entries to fill grids and prize money to keep teams afloat. What made Level 7 dangerous wasn't just their lack of skill, but their unpredictability. Professional drivers could anticipate what other professionals might do in wheel-to-wheel combat. But when you're racing against someone who might brake too early, turn in too late, or simply panic under pressure, everyone on track was at risk. Several accidents in the 1,960 seconds involved Level 7 drivers who found themselves in situations their limited experience couldn't handle. The tragic irony is that some Level 7 drivers had access to better equipment than far more talented racers simply because they could afford it. While future champions struggled with unreliable engines and worn tires, wealthy amateurs sometimes showed up with pristine machinery they had no idea how to exploit. Level 6 drivers were the journeymen, the nearly men who had genuine racing talent but lacked that extra something needed to climb higher. These were often national champions from smaller racing nations or drivers who had shown promise in junior categories but couldn't quite make the leap to elite competition. Many Level 6 drivers spent their entire careers hoping for one good break, one reliable car, one season where everything would come together. They were fast enough to occasionally surprise people with a points finish, but consistent enough to avoid the worst accidents that claimed less experienced drivers. The most heartbreaking stories in 1,960 seconds Formula One often involved Level 6 drivers. Take someone like Ronnie Bucknam, an American driver who showed flashes of brilliance but never had the right combination of car and opportunity. Or consider the various Italian drivers who could win at Monza in front of their home crowd but struggled everywhere else. These drivers understood the sport deeply. They knew the tracks, understood race strategy, and could develop a car's setup. What they lacked was either that final tenth of a second per lap that separated good from great, or the political connections needed to secure drives with competitive teams. In an era when driver lineups often depended more on sponsorship and nationality than pure speed, talented Level 6 drivers frequently found themselves watching from the sidelines. Many Level 6 drivers had long careers, sometimes spanning the entire decade. They provided stability to smaller teams and often became valuable development drivers who could give engineers useful feedback about car handling and performance. While they rarely won races, their consistency made them valuable team members in an era when simply finishing races was often a challenge. Level 5 represents the solid professionals who formed the backbone of Formula One in the 1,960 seconds. These were drivers who could run competitively with anyone on their day, occasionally win races, and were always in the hunt for championship points. They were the drivers team managers could count on to bring the car home and score valuable points in the Constructors' Championship. Level 5 drivers typically had one or two signature victories that defined their careers. They might win their home Grand Prix or capitalize on a chaotic race where faster drivers encountered problems. What separated them from higher levels wasn't necessarily raw speed, but consistency under pressure and the ability to perform when championship points were on the line. Think about drivers like Richie Ginther or Pedro Rodriguez. Both were genuinely fast, both could win races, and both were respected by their peers as serious professional racing drivers. Ginther won the 1,965 Mexican Grand Prix in dramatic fashion, while Rodriguez was capable of stunning performances that reminded everyone why he was considered one of the most naturally gifted drivers of his generation. The tragedy of Level 5 was that many of these drivers were casualties of the sport's deadly nature. Unlike the wealthy amateurs who might race occasionally, Level 5 drivers raced full-time, exposing themselves repeatedly to mortal danger. The mathematics of survival worked against them. Even if you were skilled enough to avoid most accidents, racing every weekend for an entire decade meant the odds eventually caught up with many talented professionals. Level 5 drivers often became fan favorites precisely because they were relatable. Unlike the superstars who seemed almost superhuman, Level 5 drivers had to work for every tenth of a second, every championship point, every moment of glory. When they won, it felt earned in a way that dominant champions sometimes didn't. These drivers also played crucial roles in developing the sport's safety standards. Because they raced regularly but weren't always in the fastest cars, they experienced the full range of Formula One's dangers and often became advocates for improved safety equipment and track modifications. Level 4 drivers were the stars who could have been champions under different circumstances. These were supremely talented racers who had the speed to win multiple races and challenge for championships, but were held back by unreliable cars, bad timing, or simply the misfortune of racing during an era dominated by transcendent talents. The classic Level 4 driver of the 1,960 seconds was Dan Gurney. Here was a driver who could win at any track, in any conditions, against any competition. Gurney won races for Ferrari, Brabham, and his own Eagle team. He was one of the few drivers who could match Jim Clark's pace on any given weekend. Yet he never won a world championship, largely because the cars he drove were often less reliable than those available to his main rivals. Another perfect example was Lorenzo Bandini, the Italian driver who seemed destined for greatness before his tragic death at Monaco in 1967. Bandini had the speed to run with anyone, the tactical awareness to win races through strategy, and the charisma to become a true star of the sport. His victory at the 1964 Austrian Grand Prix showed he had championship potential, but fate intervened before he could fulfill it. Level 4 drivers often had signature moments that defined not just their careers, but entire seasons. They were the drivers who could steal wins from favorites, who could turn a processional race into a classic through sheer determination and skill. They were also often the most tragic figures in the sport, because their talent made their losses feel even more devastating. What made Level 4 particularly interesting was how team politics affected their careers. Many of these drivers had the speed to be champions, but found themselves in supporting roles to more established stars, or driving for teams that prioritized other drivers for political or commercial reasons. The talent was there, the opportunity often wasn't. Level 3 encompasses the multiple race winners who were always championship contenders but fell just short of the ultimate prize. These drivers dominated entire seasons, won races in dominant fashion, and were genuine threats to win the World Championship year after year. John Surtees stands as the perfect Level 3 driver, though he did win one championship in 1964. What places him at Level 3 rather than higher is that his championship was somewhat circumstantial, coming in a year when several faster drivers had reliability problems. Surtees was incredibly versatile, the only man to win world championships on both 2 wheels and 4, but he was rarely the outright fastest driver in any given season. Jackie Ickx represents another fascinating Level 3 case study. The Belgian driver was phenomenally quick, particularly in wet conditions where he was arguably unbeatable. Ickx could win races that seemed impossible, driving cars that had no business being competitive to victories through sheer skill and determination. Yet he never quite put together a complete championship season, often let down by mechanical failures or strategic mistakes. Level 3 drivers were the ones who made championships interesting. Without them, the 1,960 seconds would have been dominated by 1 or 2 drivers running away with easy titles. Instead, championships often came down to the final races, with Level 3 drivers pushing the ultimate champions to perform at their absolute peak. These drivers also often had the longest careers, racing successfully from the early 1,960 seconds into the 1,970 seconds, and sometimes beyond. Their combination of speed, intelligence, and adaptability allowed them to remain competitive even as the sport evolved rapidly around them. They were the drivers who proved that pure speed wasn't everything, that racecraft and experience could sometimes overcome raw pace. The psychology of Level 3 was particularly interesting. These drivers knew they were capable of winning championships, had often come close to doing so, but had to live with the knowledge that circumstances or luck had prevented them from reaching the ultimate goal. Some were motivated by this frustration, others were broken by it. Level 2 is reserved for the world champions who dominated their eras and redefined what was possible in Formula 1. The 1,960 seconds produced several such drivers, men who didn't just win championships, but won them in ways that changed how people thought about racing itself. Graham Hill epitomizes Level 2 achievement. The man they called Mr. Monaco won 2 world championships during the decade. But more importantly, he represented a new type of Formula 1 driver. Hill was the complete professional, the driver who could win through racecraft when he wasn't the fastest, who could develop a car's setup to extract maximum performance, and who understood the political dimensions of the sport as well as anyone. Hill's victory in the 1968 championship, won in the shadow of Jim Clark's death, showed exactly why he belongs at Level 2. When the sport's greatest talent was suddenly gone, Hill stepped forward to fill the void, providing stability and professionalism when Formula One desperately needed both. His ability to win races through strategy and consistency, even when facing faster opponents, made him a worthy champion. Denny Hulme represents another fascinating Level 2 case. The New Zealander won the 1967 championship driving for Brabham, often overshadowed by more charismatic teammates but consistently fast enough to capitalize when opportunities arose. Hulme's championship was built on steady accumulation of points rather than dominant victories, but it was no less deserved for being less spectacular. Level 2 drivers were often the most complete racers of their era. They could win races through raw speed when they had the fastest car. But they could also win through strategy, racecraft, and intelligence when they didn't. They understood that championships weren't won in single races but over entire seasons, requiring a combination of speed, consistency, and tactical awareness that few drivers possessed. What separated Level 2 from Level 1 wasn't necessarily peak performance, but rather the breadth and consistency of their dominance. Level 2 drivers had weaknesses that could be exploited, tracks where they struggled, conditions that didn't suit their driving style. They were great champions, but they were still human. Level 1 is reserved for the transcendent talents who redefined what was possible behind the wheel of a racing car. In the 1,960 seconds, this level had exactly one occupant, Jim Clark. Clark wasn't just faster than his contemporaries. He was faster in a way that seemed to violate the laws of physics. When other drivers were finding the absolute limit of their car's performance, Clark would find another second per lap that nobody else knew existed. He won races by margins that made his victories look effortless, but anyone who understood racing knew they were watching something unprecedented. The numbers tell part of Clark's story. 25 Grand Prix victories in a career that lasted barely a decade. 2 world championships that could easily have been 5 if his cars had been more reliable. Pole positions earned by margins so large that timing officials sometimes checked their equipment to make sure it was working correctly. But statistics don't capture what made Clark truly special. He had an almost supernatural ability to feel what a car was doing, to sense the precise moment when tires were about to lose grip, when an engine was about to fail, when weather conditions were about to change. Other great drivers had to think their way around a racetrack. Clark simply flowed, finding the fastest possible line through pure instinct. Clark's dominance wasn't limited to Formula One. He won the Indianapolis 500, dominated sports car racing, and was competitive in virtually every form of motorsport he attempted. This versatility wasn't unusual for racing drivers of his era, but Clark's level of success across different disciplines was unprecedented. The tragic irony of Clark's career was that his peak performance came during the most dangerous era in motorsport history. Every time he climbed into a racing car, he was risking death in pursuit of speeds that pushed both man and machine beyond reasonable limits. When he was finally killed in a Formula 2 race at Hockenheim in 1968, the sport lost not just its greatest driver, but a talent so exceptional that some wondered if anyone would ever reach such heights again. What made Clark Level 1 wasn't just his speed, but his influence on everyone around him. Other drivers raised their game simply by racing against him. Engineers worked harder to build cars worthy of his talent. The sport itself became more professional, more serious, because everyone understood they were witnessing something special. The hierarchy of 1,960 seconds. Formula One drivers reveals a sport in transition, caught between its amateur roots and professional future. At every level, drivers faced mortal danger simply by pursuing their passion. Some were rewarded with fame and fortune, others with tragedy and obscurity. What's remarkable is how this brutal decade produced so many legendary figures. The very dangers that made the sport so deadly also seemed to attract exceptional individuals who were willing to risk everything for the chance at glory. Each level of our hierarchy contributed something essential to Formula One's evolution from a wealthy man's hobby into the global spectacle we know today. The legacy of 1,960 seconds. Formula One isn't just about the champions and race winners, but about all 7 levels of drivers who collectively created the foundation for modern motorsport. Their courage, skill, and sacrifice transformed a dangerous pastime into a legitimate sport that continues to captivate audiences worldwide. Understanding their hierarchy helps us appreciate not just individual achievements, but the collective effort that made Formula One's golden age possible. What if I told you that in the 1,970 seconds, Formula One had a secret hierarchy that nobody talked about, where drivers were unofficially ranked into 7 distinct levels that determined everything from their paychecks to whether they'd survive the next race? Today, we're diving deep into the brutal reality of 1,970 seconds Formula One, where your level in this invisible ladder could mean the difference between legend status and being forgotten forever. The 1,970 seconds were the deadliest decade in Formula One history. Drivers died at an alarming rate, cars were mechanical death traps, and the sport operated under a ruthless social structure that would shock modern fans. But here's what's fascinating. Within this chaos, a clear pecking order emerged that went far beyond just lap times and championship points. Picture this. It's 1,975, and you're standing in the Monaco paddock. The smell of high-octane fuel fills the air. Mechanics are frantically working on cars that look more like rocket ships than automobiles. And drivers are suiting up knowing there's a genuine chance they might not come home. But look closer, and you'll notice something interesting. The way drivers interact, where they park, who gets the best mechanics, who the media flocks to, it's all predetermined by an unspoken hierarchy. Let me take you through each of these 7 levels, starting from the bottom and working our way up to the gods of the sport. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some drivers with incredible talent never made it past level 3, while others with modest skills somehow climbed to level 6. Level 7 represents the bottom feeders of Formula One, the drivers who were essentially paying customers pretending to be racers. These weren't professional athletes in any modern sense. They were wealthy enthusiasts, often middle-aged businessmen or aristocrats who bought their way into the sport. Think of drivers like Davina Gallica or Lamberto Leone. They typically owned small teams or had personal sponsorship deals that were really just vanity projects. These level 7 drivers faced constant ridicule from their peers. They were slower than everyone else, often by embarrassing margins. During qualifying sessions, they'd be lapped by the serious competitors. The media largely ignored them except to occasionally mock their presence. Safety was already questionable in the 70s, but these drivers made it worse by being unpredictable on track. What's tragic about level 7 is that some of these drivers genuinely loved racing, but they lacked the fundamental skills needed for Formula One. They'd show up to races in inferior equipment, with skeleton crews for mechanics, and somehow convince themselves they belonged on the same grid as future world champions. The financial barrier to entry was much lower back then, which enabled this phenomenon. The social dynamics were brutal. Other drivers would openly dismiss them in interviews. Team principals saw them as necessary evils. Their entry fees helped fund the sport, but nobody wanted to be associated with them professionally. Many level 7 drivers lasted only a few races before reality set in, though some persisted for years, seemingly immune to embarrassment. Level 6 drivers were the journeymen, competent but unremarkable racers who formed the backbone of the grid. These were professional drivers in the truest sense, but they lacked that extra spark that separates good from great. Drivers like Harold Ertl, Ian Ashley, or Rolf Stommelen fit this category during certain periods of their careers. Level 6 drivers could occasionally score points if circumstances aligned perfectly. They were reliable, rarely crashed due to driver error, and served as valuable team players. Teams liked having them because they provided steady feedback on car development and didn't demand astronomical salaries. They were the blue-collar workers of Formula One. These drivers often had long careers, precisely because they were dependable. While level 7 drivers flamed out quickly, level 6 drivers could maintain their positions for years. They understood their role in the ecosystem and rarely overstepped boundaries. The media gave them respectful but minimal coverage, and fans appreciated their workmanlike approach. The frustrating reality for level 6 drivers was that they could see level 5 just out of reach. They had the skills to belong in Formula One, but lacked the killer instinct or raw speed to climb higher. Many spent their entire careers wondering what might have been if they'd had better equipment or caught a break at the right moment. Level 5 represents the solid midfield runners who occasionally threatened for podiums and kept fans on the edge of their seats. These drivers had genuine talent and could produce moments of brilliance. Names like Ronnie Peterson during his less competitive years, or Carlos Reutemann before he joined top teams, exemplify this level. Level 5 drivers were the stars of the midfield battles that often proved more exciting than fights for the championship. They could extract maximum performance from mediocre equipment and occasionally embarrass drivers from higher levels when conditions favored them. Rain races were their specialty, the great equalizer where skill mattered more than horsepower. The media loved Level 5 drivers because they provided compelling storylines. Underdog victories, heroic drives in inferior machinery, and dramatic battles for minor points positions made for great television. Fans could relate to these drivers more than the superstars at the top of the hierarchy. What separated Level 5 from Level 6 was consistency at a higher level and the ability to occasionally transcend their equipment's limitations. They were legitimate threats to score points regularly and could even steal podium finishes when circumstances aligned. Team principals saw them as valuable assets who could maximize whatever package they were given. Level 4 drivers were the championship contenders who could win races and challenge for titles given the right equipment. These were elite talents who formed the upper echelon of Formula One. Drivers like Jody Scheckter, James Hunt, or Alan Jones during their peak years represent this category perfectly. Level 4 drivers commanded respect from everyone in the paddock. They had proven they could handle pressure, deliver when it mattered, and adapt to different cars and conditions. The media treated them as serious championship threats, and manufacturers courted them for factory drives. Their presence in a team immediately elevated that organization's status. These drivers possessed the complete package: raw speed, racecraft, mental toughness, and the ability to develop cars. They could perform consistently at the highest level and rarely made costly errors. When Level 4 drivers had competitive equipment, they were automatic favorites for race victories. The gulf between Level 4 and Level 3 was enormous. Level 4 drivers had achieved everything except sustained dominance. They were proven winners who could beat anyone on their day, but they lacked that final element that transforms good champions into legends. Level 3 houses the multiple world champions and consistent race winners who dominated extended periods. These were the drivers who defined eras and established themselves as all-time greats. Jackie Stewart, Emerson Fittipaldi, and Mario Andretti represent this elite category during the 70s. Level 3 drivers were methodical in their excellence. They combined natural talent with professional approaches that maximized their advantages. Stewart revolutionized driver safety and professionalism. Fittipaldi brought Brazilian flair and technical expertise. Andretti showcased versatility across different racing disciplines. The media treated Level 3 drivers as celebrities beyond just racing. They appeared on talk shows, endorsed major products, and became household names, even among casual sports fans. Their opinions on car development could influence entire design philosophies, and their choice of teams could determine championship outcomes. What elevated these drivers beyond Level 4 was sustained excellence over multiple seasons. They didn't just win championships, they dominated their competition and established new standards for professional racing. They were the measuring sticks against which all other drivers were judged. Level 2 represents the transcendent talents who redefined what was possible in Formula One. During the 70s, this level belonged primarily to Niki Lauda, who combined raw speed with intellectual approach to racing that was decades ahead of its time. Lauda's methodical preparation, technical feedback, and mental toughness set him apart from everyone else. Level 2 drivers possessed an almost supernatural ability to extract performance from any car. Lauda could diagnose mechanical problems through feel alone and communicate solutions to engineers with surgical precision. His comeback from the 1976 Nürburgring accident demonstrated mental fortitude that bordered on superhuman. The respect Level 2 drivers commanded was universal and absolute. Even their fiercest competitors acknowledged their superiority. Team principals would restructure entire organizations around Level 2 drivers. The media covered their every move with reverence, typically reserved for heads of state. What made Level 2 special was their ability to elevate everyone around them. Mechanics worked harder, engineers thought deeper, and entire teams performed better simply because a Level 2 driver was leading the effort. They were transformational figures who left permanent marks on the sport. Level 1 stands alone at the pinnacle, a level so exclusive that arguably no driver consistently occupied it throughout the entire decade. This was the realm of absolute perfection, where a driver could dominate any equipment in any conditions against any competition. Some might argue that Stewart approached this level during his peak years, or that Lauda touched it briefly, but Level 1 represents theoretical perfection that may be humanly impossible to sustain. A true Level 1 driver would win championships in inferior equipment, never make errors under pressure, and demonstrate superiority so absolute that their dominance would be boring to watch. They would transcend the sport itself and become cultural icons whose influence extended far beyond racing. The fascinating aspect of this hierarchy is how fluid it could be. Drivers moved between levels based on equipment, confidence, experience, and sometimes just luck. Peterson oscillated between levels 3 and 5, depending on his car. Hunt jumped from level 6 to level 4 in a single season with McLaren. Equipment played a massive role in determining a parent driver level. The most talented driver in an uncompetitive car might appear to be level 6, while a mediocre driver in a dominant car could look like level 4. This created ongoing debates about true driver talent versus circumstantial success. The psychological aspects were crucial too. Some drivers cracked under pressure and dropped levels permanently. Others found extra motivation that elevated their performance beyond their natural talent. The mental game was just as important as physical skill, especially given the life or death stakes of 70s racing. Team dynamics significantly influenced these levels. Drivers needed compatible relationships with engineers, mechanics, and team management to perform at their peak. Personality conflicts could artificially suppress a driver's level, while perfect team chemistry could elevate performance beyond individual capability. The media's role in establishing and reinforcing these levels cannot be understated. Coverage patterns influenced public perception, which affected sponsorship opportunities, which determined equipment quality, which ultimately impacted performance levels. It was a self-reinforcing cycle that could trap drivers in their assigned positions. Safety concerns added another dimension to the hierarchy. Level 7 drivers were genuinely dangerous to themselves and others. Level 1 drivers had to possess not just speed, but also the judgment to avoid unnecessary risks. The best drivers found the perfect balance between aggression and self-preservation. Looking back from today's perspective, this informal ranking system reveals harsh truths about professional sports hierarchies. Talent alone wasn't sufficient. Drivers needed political skills, media savvy, financial backing, and perfect timing to climb the ladder. Some of history's most naturally gifted drivers never escaped the lower levels due to circumstances beyond their control. The legacy of this hierarchy extends into modern Formula One. Today's sport has more formal structures and safety nets, but similar invisible rankings still exist. Young drivers still struggle to escape certain perceived levels, while established stars maintain positions through reputation as much as current performance. Understanding these 7 levels helps explain why certain drivers are remembered as legends, while equally talented competitors are forgotten. Success in Formula One required navigating this complex social and professional ecosystem, not just driving fast cars quickly. The 1,970 seconds represented a unique moment in motorsport history when individual personality and raw talent could still overcome institutional advantages. The hierarchy was brutal but permeable. Drivers could genuinely transcend their circumstances through exceptional performance and smart positioning. This ranking system also reveals how much Formula One has evolved. Modern drivers operate within highly structured professional environments with extensive support systems. The lone wolf mentality that characterized many 70s drivers would be impossible today. The human drama embedded within this hierarchy made the 70s compelling in ways that pure racing action couldn't match. Fans could follow drivers' journeys through the levels, celebrating promotions and mourning demotions. The sport had genuine narrative stakes beyond just championship points. These 7 levels of 70s Formula One drivers created a complex ecosystem that rewarded diverse skills and approaches. From the wealthy hobbyists at level 7 to the transcendent talents approaching level 1, Each category played a role in creating the most dangerous and exciting era in motorsport history. The brutality of this system ultimately pushed the sport toward greater professionalism and safety. The tragic costs of maintaining such extreme hierarchies forced Formula One to evolve into something more sustainable and humane, while hopefully preserving the competitive intensity that made those dangerous years so captivating. Understanding where drivers fit within these levels helps us appreciate both their achievements and their limitations within the context of their era. What if I told you that Formula One in the 1,980 seconds had a secret hierarchy that determined who lived and who died on the track? Today we're diving deep into the 7 distinct levels of drivers that existed during the most dangerous and thrilling decade in motorsport history. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why some drivers became legends, while others became cautionary tales, and which level separated the champions from the casualties. The 1,980 seconds weren't just about neon lights and synthesizers. In Formula One, this decade represented the perfect storm of technological revolution, political warfare, and raw human courage. While the world was dancing to Madonna, F1 drivers were dancing with death at speeds that would make your heart stop. But here's what most people don't realize. Not every driver who strapped into those carbon fiber rockets belonged there. Let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with. Imagine machines generating over 1,000 horsepower in qualifying trim, with virtually no safety systems, driven on circuits where concrete barriers waited just inches from the racing line. Now imagine that only a select few drivers possessed the supernatural combination of skill, intelligence, and sheer audacity needed to tame these beasts. The rest? They were playing a game they couldn't win. The 7 levels I'm about to reveal weren't official rankings or team hierarchies. They were invisible tiers that emerged naturally from the crucible of competition, each one defined by specific characteristics that determined a driver's fate on track. Understanding these levels is like having a decoder ring for one of motorsport's most complex eras. Level 7 represents the bottom tier, the cannon fodder drivers. These were the men who showed up with more courage than talent, often backed by sponsors who valued marketing over motorsport. They possessed basic racing skills, sure, but in the context of 1,980 seconds, Formula One, basic wasn't nearly enough. These drivers typically lasted 1 or 2 seasons before reality caught up with them. The cannon fodder drivers shared several defining characteristics. First, they lacked the technical understanding necessary to provide meaningful feedback to engineers. In an era where car development happened at breakneck speed, this was a death sentence for competitiveness. Second, they couldn't adapt their driving style to compensate for inferior machinery. When your car handles like a shopping cart, you need supernatural talent to extract performance. These guys didn't have it. Most tragically, cannon fodder drivers often didn't recognize their own limitations. They'd charge into corners with the same commitment as Ayrton Senna, but without the reflexes or spatial awareness to back it up. The results were predictable and often devastating. Some learned quickly and moved to other racing series. Others learned the hard way, if they were lucky enough to learn at all. Level 6 brings us to the survivors. These drivers possessed one crucial advantage over the cannon fodder: self-awareness. They understood their limitations and drove within them. While they rarely challenged for wins or even podiums, they consistently brought their cars home in one piece, which in the 1,980 seconds was no small achievement. Survivors typically had long careers precisely because they knew when to push and when to back off. They could read dangerous situations developing and extract themselves before disaster struck. This wasn't cowardice, it was intelligence. They understood that in Formula One, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is lift off the throttle. The downside of being a survivor was perpetual frustration. These drivers often had the technical knowledge to know exactly how much faster they could go if only they had better equipment or slightly more natural talent. They lived in the purgatory between mediocrity and greatness, watching opportunities slip away while maintaining just enough performance to keep their seats. Level 5 introduces us to the specialists. These drivers excelled in specific conditions or at particular types of circuits, but lacked the versatility needed for championship contention. A specialist might be absolutely untouchable in wet weather, but struggle on high-speed ovals. Or They might dominate street circuits, but get eaten alive at traditional road courses. What made specialists valuable was their ability to steal wins when conditions aligned perfectly with their strengths. Teams would sometimes build entire strategies around extracting maximum performance from their specialist drivers during favorable weekends. This created some of the most memorable upsets in 1,980 seconds. Formula One. When underdogs would suddenly find themselves leading races they had no business winning. The frustration of being a specialist was knowing that championship glory would always remain just out of reach. These drivers could taste greatness, sometimes literally leading championship races, but they lacked the consistency across all conditions and circuits needed to mount sustained title challenges. Level 4 represents the workhorses. These were the reliable, consistent performers who formed the backbone of competitive teams. Workhorses possess solid technical skills, good racecraft, and the mental fortitude to perform under pressure. They rarely made spectacular mistakes, but they also rarely produced spectacular performances. What distinguished workhorses was their value to team development. They could provide consistent, reliable feedback that helped engineers improve the car throughout the season. In an era where testing was unlimited and development crucial, this made workhorses incredibly valuable team members, even if they weren't championship material. The tragedy of being a workhorse was watching truly talented drivers waste superior equipment while you extracted maximum performance from inferior machinery. Many workhorses knew they could have won championships with better cars, but the politics and economics of Formula One rarely aligned to give them that opportunity. Level 3 brings us to the contenders. These drivers possessed genuine championship caliber talent but lacked either the right equipment or the perfect timing needed to claim titles. Contenders could win races, challenge for championships, and occasionally produce moments of pure racing genius that left spectators breathless. What separated contenders from lower levels was their ability to elevate inferior machinery through pure driving skill. Give a contender a car capable of finishing 6th, and they'd somehow drag it onto the podium. They possessed that indefinable quality that separates very good drivers from truly special ones, the ability to find speed that doesn't exist on paper. The curse of being a contender was proximity to greatness without quite achieving it. These drivers often finished second in championships, sometimes multiple times. They lived with the knowledge that they possessed the talent to be world champions, but were denied by circumstances beyond their control. Level 2 represents the masters. These were drivers who combined exceptional natural talent with deep technical understanding and unshakable mental strength. Masters didn't just drive cars, they became one with them. They could adapt instantly to changing conditions, extract performance from any machinery, and perform at their absolute peak when pressure was highest. What made masters special was their ability to elevate everyone around them. When a master joined a team, the entire operation improved. Engineers learned more about car development, mechanics raised their game, and even rival drivers pushed harder to match their standard. Masters didn't just win races, they advanced the entire sport. The burden of being a master was expectation. Every race became a referendum on their abilities. Fans, media, and teams expected perfection, and anything less was considered failure. This pressure destroyed some potentially great careers and forged others into legendary status. Level 1 stands alone, the transcendent drivers. These rare individuals didn't just excel at Formula One, they redefined what was possible. Transcendent drivers possess supernatural car control, strategic thinking that bordered on precognition, and the ability to perform miracles when everything was on the line. Only a handful of drivers, in 1,980 seconds, Formula One achieved true transcendence. They combined every positive attribute from lower levels while adding something extra, something that couldn't be taught or learned. When transcendent drivers got behind the wheel, they didn't just drive fast, they rewrote the laws of physics. What separated transcendent drivers was their impact beyond racing results. They changed how people thought about what was possible in a racing car. They inspired entire generations of drivers and fans. They became larger than the sport itself, while somehow embodying everything that made the sport great. Now here's where this gets really interesting. The gap between each level wasn't linear. The difference between level 7 and level 6 was relatively small, maybe a second or two per lap. But the gap between level 2 and level 1? That was measured in moments of pure magic that couldn't be quantified by stopwatches. The 1,980 seconds created perfect conditions for this hierarchy to emerge. The combination of dangerous cars, limited safety equipment, and intense competition meant that natural selection happened quickly and brutally. Drivers either adapted and climbed the levels, or they were eliminated from the gene pool entirely. Technology played a crucial role in determining which level a driver could reach. The introduction of turbocharged engines, advanced aerodynamics, and electronic systems meant that success required both traditional driving skills and the ability to master complex, technical systems. Some drivers thrived in this environment, others were overwhelmed by the complexity. The political landscape of 1,980 seconds Formula One also influenced the hierarchy. Team politics, sponsor relationships, and national rivalries all affected which drivers got opportunities to prove themselves. Sometimes exceptional talent languished in inferior equipment, while lesser drivers enjoyed success in superior cars. What makes understanding these levels so crucial is how they influenced every aspect of the sport. Race strategies were built around exploiting the weaknesses of lower-level drivers while maximizing the strengths of higher-level ones. Team dynamics shifted based on the relative levels of their driver pairing. Even circuit design began to favor certain types of drivers over others. The financial pressures of the era also shaped the hierarchy. Unlike modern Formula One, where every team has massive budgets and professional support structures, 1,980 seconds, teams operated with shoestring resources and skeleton crews. This meant that driver skill often had to compensate for mechanical or strategic disadvantages. Weather conditions revealed the true hierarchy more clearly than any other factor. Rain was the great equalizer that stripped away the advantages of superior equipment and exposed raw driving talent. Transcendent drivers thrived in adverse conditions, while lower-level drivers often struggled just to stay on track. The mental game. In 1,980 seconds, Formula One was unlike anything in modern motorsport. Drivers faced real physical danger every time they got behind the wheel. This psychological pressure created another dimension to the hierarchy, separating those who could perform under ultimate stress from those who wilted when life and death hung in the balance. As we look back at this incredible decade, the 7-level hierarchy helps explain some of Formula One's most puzzling stories. Why did some incredibly talented drivers never achieve the success their skills seemed to promise? Why did certain journeyman drivers enjoy surprisingly long careers? The answer lies in understanding exactly which level they occupied and how that shaped their destiny. The legacy of 1,980 seconds. Formula One isn't just about the champions who claimed titles or the heroes who saved lives. It's about understanding that greatness in motorsport exists on multiple levels, each one valid and valuable in its own way. From the cannon fodder who provided cautionary tales to the transcendent drivers who redefined possibility, every level contributed to making this the most fascinating decade in racing history. Understanding these 7 levels doesn't diminish the achievements of drivers at any tier. Instead, it helps us appreciate the unique challenges and contributions of each one. The 1,980 seconds proved that Formula One's success required more than just being fast. It demanded a perfect storm of talent, timing, equipment, and sheer force of will that few drivers could achieve. The next time you watch footage from this incredible era, remember the invisible hierarchy that shaped every moment. Behind every overtake, every crash, and every celebration stood drivers operating at their maximum level, pushing against the boundaries of human capability and machines that would kill them without hesitation. That hierarchy didn't disappear when the 1,980 seconds ended. It evolved, adapted, and continues to influence Formula One today. The 7 levels remind us that greatness in motorsport isn't just about crossing the finish line first. It's about understanding exactly where you belong in the grand hierarchy of speed, skill, and survival.